Today I'm going to be showing you how to create value and shading on some basic forms, and today we are going to do a sphere. Now the first thing to understanding shading is we have to understand the parts of the values. So let's take a look at a sphere and break it down by the shadow parts, highlights and shadows. So you'll see that the very lightest part is what we call the highlight. That is where the light directly hits the object. And then that highlight is going to fade into what we call a midtone. It's kind of that blending from the light into the dark. There's a core shadow, which is on the opposite side of the highlight, but it doesn't necessarily go all the way around, and it doesn't always go to the exact edge. So it is a darker area, or the darkest part of the actual object. That's called a core shadow. And then beyond the core shadow, you'll see that we have reflected light. Now the way that light travels, it bounces off of the table, it bounces off of things around the room, and some of it bounces back onto the underside or the back side of the object. So you'll see that it gets a little bit lighter as it goes out to the back side. And then we also have the cast shadow. And that cast shadow is the shadow that is reflected or shown onto the surface that the object is sitting on. So imagine when you're a little kid and you go outside in the sunshine and you see your shadow on the driveway or on the sidewalk. That is your cast shadow. So let's get started by drawing our objects. I'm going to create a sphere today, and I want to make a circle, but I don't want to make it super tiny. So I'm going to trace around an object that I have in my house that is round, and I'm just going to use a coffee cup. So I'm going to place my coffee cup down. It's a good size, and I can trace around to get that circle. So that way I'm not drawing it really tiny, and then I'm not drawing it super huge. So with my drawing pencils, my blending stumps, my kneaded eraser, these are the supplies that I'm going to be using. I'm going to start really with my background. I don't want to ignore the background. The drawing looks a lot more complete if I put in a background. So you'll see the reference image that I'm working from down in the corner, the photograph, and I'm going to start by adding in some of that background on the upper area. Now I filled this in with a 2B pencil, and it has a pretty definitive edge, and it's also really important that you go right up to the edge of the circle. And I went over a little bit. We'll clean it up in a second. I'll show you how to do that. But I don't want it to just stop. I want it to fade as it does in the example. So I'll pick up an HB pencil, one that's a little bit lighter, and lay in a little bit of that blended value. So that isn't 100% blended yet. That's just enough so that I can get started in understanding what my shape and my values are going to be. Before I go any further, I'm going to draw in my cast shadow. That's that roundness at the bottom. And cast shadows are in a circle. They're more of an oval. So be sure when you're putting it in, it's like you're drawing through the object, but not really. And that way it is going to look more complete instead of looking like a tongue that is sticking out or just jammed into something. So if I would imagine drawing all the way through. All right. Now I'm going to clean up the edge. I kind of colored over my line a little bit, and I want to make sure my edges are nice and clean and sharp. So I'm going to take my kneaded eraser, make sure that it's nice and pliable. Remember, play with it. If you warm it up in your hands and play with it, it's like taffy. Get it nice and soft. And if I take a really nice clean edge, I'm going to make it into a wedge, like pinch it into a nice kind of a sharp pointed wedge shape. And that is what I'm going to use to clean up that edge. It's almost like drawing with this eraser as opposed to erasing. I don't scrub to erase with it. I'm really using it like a pencil, and I'm going to redraw with the eraser that edge. And then I just find a new clean edge, same thing. So what this does is it makes that edge nice and sharp and nice and clean. I erased a little bit more, which is okay, because when I go back and do my blending, I will get right up to that line again. But I don't want to go over the line, but I want to make sure I actually get to the line. My next step I'm going to do is blend my background, and I can use the blending stump or the tortillon, either one, whichever one you like, or if you found another material that you like better with the last exercise, then use that. It's completely fine. But I like the blending stump, so I'm going to use the blending stump. Remember to bend it or soften that up a little bit so it's not quite so harsh. And I'm just going to use this to blend my background together and smooth it out. All right, so that's pretty good as a blend. I have a couple of definitive lines here. I can always go back with a pencil again and layer in a little bit of extra graphite and then reblend. As you are blending and drawing, if you notice that your hand is rubbing up against it and you're going to get graphite on the edge of your hand, very easily you can just take a piece of paper and lay that down as a barrier, so that way I can rest my hand on it and I'm not smearing my drawing. Keeps your hand nice and clean. Okay, I'm going to start now inside my sphere, and for this I am going to take my HB pencil, that nice medium mid-tone pencil, and very lightly I am going to shade in the entire sphere, very, very lightly. You will see that I've fairly evenly used my HB pencil and created a nice even layer, and now I'm going to lay in my core shadow, which is kind of a funny shape here, doesn't necessarily go all the way across, and I'm going to use one of the darker pencils, like a 2B or maybe a 4B, and fill in that core shadow. Notice I did not go all the way down to the bottom. That's because I have that reflected light. And I also didn't go all the way over to the side over here because my light source is coming from my upper right, and I'm getting a little bit more light on this side than I am on that side. Now, doing correct shading is really all about layering. So I've laid in some of my shadows or some of my values, but I'm going to layer in more just to make them deeper and darker and blend more. So I'm picking up an even darker pencil, your 4B or your 6B. I'm going to layer in that cast shadow or that core shadow again. Okay, and then I will switch back to my HB pencil again and layer in another value to help blend from the mid-tone or from that dark into the lighter area. All right, now I can go back and add my blending and try and smooth this out to go from the light to the medium to the dark area. When I am using my blending stump, you don't have to push really hard, just enough to skim over the surface. The more you push, the more it grinds into the paper and the harder it is to erase or lift off if you need to. So just a light pressure is enough. And as always, if I feel like I have some pretty distinct lines that I don't want, I can always go back and add a little bit more. I'll use my 2B and I'll blend these in a little bit more. Looking pretty good. Now I am going to start working on my cast shadow. That should be fairly dark, especially right around the object itself. It gets really, really dark because there's not a whole lot of light coming from my light source. So it gets really, really dark right next to the edge, and then it diffuses out gets a little bit lighter as it gets around this outer edge. So I've picked up my 6B pencil, my darkest pencil, to initially go around my object and fill in the core of that cast shadow, and then I will lighten up my pressure or switch to a different pencil towards the outside. And now I go back with the blending stump and blend that core shadow. And I want to darken right next to the object a little bit more, so I picked up my 6B again to layer in a little bit more. Now my reflected light, I didn't erase yet, and I also need to lay in my highlight a little bit more. So I'm going to go back with my kneaded eraser. Again, I'm going to create a nice little sharp edge, nice sharp point, or a wedge shape. And I'm going to go back and again draw in that outer line right along my cast shadow. One, to kind of clean it up and straighten it, because right now it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's also going to help lay in that reflected light. Now I'm not going to add any more pencil. I'm just going to use whatever graphite happens to be on my blending stump, and very lightly I'm going to blend that eraser mark back into this middle value that I have. And the last thing I will need to do is I want to pull out my highlight, the very lightest area of my object. So I'm going to take my kneaded eraser, but this time I'm not going to make a wedge. I'm going to make a nice flat spot, like a nice smooth flat spot, and I'm really just going to tap or dab. I'm not going to scrub, and it is going to pick up some graphite. Then I'm going to find another clean spot. Same thing, dot again. Maybe a third time or a fourth time, however many times you need. And that is going to help lift off the graphite from an area to create a more distinct highlight. And if you need to, again, very lightly go back and blend, you can. Hopefully you'll notice that that outline that you initially made, for the most part, disappeared. The change in the value from the object to the background is what makes the edge. I do have a little bit right here, which I could lighten up and erase if I needed to. But I no longer should have that big heavy black outline. And there you go. You have your first shaded sphere using blending. So now what I want you to do is, in your sketchbook, I want you to add the other 3 basic forms, a cube, a cylinder, and a cone, using value blending and shading. Those 4 objects, the sphere, the cone, the cube, the cylinder, you'll need to take photos of and upload them to the Google Classroom. Have fun!